She was playing in the sandbox with her old teddy bear, but a neighbor decided that this girl was out of place here and took her toy away. The police arrived on a false call, and then the whole street learned the truth. See how this story ended. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The morning sun touched the rooftops of Willow Creek with a soft golden light, making the neatly painted shutters gleam as if they had been polished for the day ahead. Lawns, trimmed to perfection, smelled of cut grass and faint fertilizer, a scent that gave the neighborhood its illusion of constant renewal. The street seemed like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. Expensive cars stood gleaming in their driveways, mailboxes shone without a trace of rust, and children's laughter was supposed to echo between the houses like proof of safety and prosperity. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, there was an undercurrent, invisible but present, like the tension in a room where someone has spoken a word out of place. In Willow Creek, appearances mattered more than anything, and being considered an outsider was the one crime no one forgave. Amelia Johnson woke with the eagerness only a 5-year-old could carry into the world. She pressed her face against the window and saw the sun gilding the tops of the hedges, the clean sidewalks stretching like endless paths for discovery. Her small hand clutched the worn paw of Teddy, the stuffed bear that had gone everywhere with her since her mother's death. The bear's fur was matted, one of his button eyes replaced with thread and fabric from an old patch. But to Amelia, he was alive. He was memory, safety, and companionship, and she never let him go. Dressed in a lemon-yellow dress her father had chosen for her the night before, she stepped outside into their yard with a sense of ceremony, as if the morning belonged to her alone. The sandbox stood beneath a wide maple tree, filled with sand the color of pale sugar. To Amelia, it was not a sandbox, but a kingdom. She began to scoop and pat the sand into walls and towers, using a small plastic cup as a mold for turrets. She created roads where her dolls could walk, lakes made by digging shallow holes and filling them with pebbles to look like water, and hills for her bear to climb. Every handful of sand became part of a story only she could see. She talked quietly to Teddy, telling him about the castles and the tiny people who lived there. To her, the sandbox was not a corner of their yard, but the center of a world that was kind and fair. Her father, Marcus Johnson, had already left for the day. Tall, broad-shouldered, always carrying the weight of authority on his back, Marcus was not only her father, but also the police chief of the county. That morning, he had driven to headquarters before sunrise, his uniform crisp, his mind already filled with the demands of leadership. He had kissed his daughter on the forehead, reminded her to eat breakfast, and promised to be back before evening. What Amelia did not see was the worry behind his eyes, the constant question of whether he could raise her alone and give her everything she needed. Since her mother's death 2 years earlier, Marcus had carried both roles: protector and nurturer, provider and comforter. His love for Amelia was as fierce as it was quiet, hidden beneath the discipline of his profession, but always present in his actions. He had chosen Willow Creek for her sake, believing the fine schools and polished streets would offer her a future without shadows. Across the street, behind white lace curtains, another pair of eyes watched the yard. Karen Wallace sat in her armchair, holding a cup of coffee gone cold. She was 45, and her life had unraveled with cruel precision. 6 months earlier, her husband had left her for a younger woman, shattering 2 decades of marriage in a single announcement. Soon after, her job at the bank had slipped away with the words, "budget cuts," though she knew her age and bitterness had played as much a role as the company's finances. She had moved back into the narrow house left to her by her mother, a home that felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. With nothing to command in her own life, she turned her focus outward, inventing importance by policing her neighbors. She kept a notebook where she jotted times and dates, who walked their dog at odd hours, who parked in front of the wrong house, who left lights on too late at night. In her mind, she was the last line of defense for the neighborhood. In truth, she was a lonely woman consumed by resentment. The arrival of the Johnson family 2 weeks earlier had awakened something darker in her. She noticed the color of their skin before anything else, and the thought lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. Their presence meant change, and change was something she no longer knew how to handle. Each day she watched them, timing when Marcus left for work, observing when Amelia played outside, scrutinizing every visitor. She told herself it was vigilance, but in reality it was obsession. Amelia continued to shape her kingdom, unaware of the scrutiny. Her small fingers smoothed the sand on the castle walls, and she hummed a tune she had learned from her mother long ago, a tune she barely remembered, but kept alive as a fragment of comfort. The sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders, and the world seemed gentle. To her, Teddy was not just a bear. He was a reminder that love did not vanish when people left. She imagined her mother watching from the sky, proud of the city of sand growing beneath her daughter's hands. Each tower was a promise, each pathway a connection to a dream. Yet in the house across the street, Karen's thoughts twisted. She saw not innocence, but intrusion. She noticed the bright dress and thought it too loud. She watched the girl building in the sand and saw not play, but disorder. In her notebook of grievances, she had written small notes about the Johnsons, and as she watched Amelia, she tapped the pen against the page, waiting for what she believed would be inevitable confirmation. The neighborhood itself reflected this duality. Some houses were filled with laughter, with parents calling children in for breakfast, with sprinklers spinning arcs of water across the lawns. Others held silence, blinds drawn, doors opening only for deliveries. For all its beauty, Willow Creek was not a community bound by warmth, but by unspoken competition. Who kept the neatest yard, who drove the newest car, who belonged by virtue of wealth and heritage. Into this atmosphere, Marcus and Amelia had moved, believing it to be safe soil. But safety, as they would soon learn, depended not only on fences and streetlights, but on the hearts of those who watched from windows. Amelia built her city patiently, adding a bridge of twigs, planting a feather as a flag atop the tallest tower. She spoke to Teddy about her plan to make the city grow even bigger tomorrow, when her father might have time to sit and watch her build. She wanted to show him that she could create something wonderful from something as ordinary as sand. To her, this was proof that even small hands could make something lasting. But as the morning unfolded, Karen's gaze never left the child. Each scoop of sand, each imaginary gesture, fueled her conviction that she was witnessing something that did not belong. The bitterness that had eaten at her since her husband's betrayal now sharpened into suspicion. She tightened her grip on her coffee mug and whispered words only she could hear, words that promised trouble. The chapter of innocence was being written in the sandbox, but across the street, the prelude to conflict had already begun. The girl imagined castles rising strong enough to touch the sky, but in the mind of the woman who watched, those castles were already targets. Between them lay a street of asphalt and freshly painted curbs, but the true distance was far greater, a gulf carved by prejudice and fear. And as Amelia played, her bear clutched tightly in her arms, the day edged closer to the moment when innocence would collide with bitterness, and the quiet of Willow Creek would shatter. The sunlight stretched longer across the streets of Willow Creek, as the morning turned into a calm, warm afternoon. Birds fluttered from one trimmed hedge to another, and the distant hum of a lawnmower filled the air. In the middle of this comfortable quiet, Amelia remained in her sandbox, her small hands coated with grains of sand, her cheeks warm from the sun. Her castle had grown larger, the feather flag rising proudly at the top, and she leaned down to tuck Teddy into a sandy alcove she had made as his house. Her imagination wrapped the scene in stories of bravery and kindness. To her, nothing existed beyond her little kingdom. The world was still a place of wonder, and the sandbox was the center of it. But across the street, Karen Wallace's world was not filled with wonder. It was filled with emptiness and bitterness, sharpened by the sight of the girl who played so freely without any care for the heavy burdens adults carried. For Karen, the image of Amelia bent over the sand was not one of innocence, but of intrusion. Every grain of sand the child moved, every toy placed on the ground, felt like a reminder of change Karen did not want. The girl was proof that her neighborhood, once a symbol of what she thought was perfection, was slipping away from her control. Karen stepped out of her house and onto the neatly swept porch, her shoes striking the wooden steps with heavy certainty. She crossed the yard with brisk strides, the sun lighting her pale hair and narrowing her eyes against the glare. She moved with the determination of someone who believed she had caught a trespasser rather than approaching a child at play. Amelia, lost in her story, only looked up when the shadow fell over her. At first she smiled, hopeful that this adult had come to admire her castle, but the coldness in Karen's face erased that hope instantly. The woman's gaze traveled over the sandbox, the dolls, and the bear resting in the sandy alcove. To Amelia's mind, her city looked perfect, but in Karen's eyes, it was nothing but disorder. The bright dress of the child seemed out of place, the soft bear a nuisance, the sand a mess that should not have been there. Karen's voice cut through the warm air like a blade, sharp and suspicious, words loaded with accusation rather than curiosity. Amelia's hand stilled. She blinked and tried to answer, but the tone frightened her. She wanted to explain that she was just building, just playing, as her daddy always encouraged her to do. But fear twisted her words. She gave her name, her house, and her address, but her young mind faltered under the sudden pressure. She confused the numbers. She said 412 instead of 421. It was a slip any child could make, especially while flustered and scared. But for Karen, it was the confirmation she had been waiting for. In her mind, this mistake wasn't an innocent error. It was proof. Proof that the girl did not belong here. Proof that she was lying. That she was someone else's responsibility, perhaps even someone left behind to cause trouble. Amelia's small chest rose and fell faster. She reached instinctively for Teddy, hugging him to her chest. The bear smelled of home, of safety, and she needed that reassurance. But Karen's hand shot forward, quick and harsh, and wrenched the stuffed animal from her grasp. The child gasped, as if the air itself had been stolen from her. To lose Teddy was to lose the last tie to her mother's comfort, and in that moment, Amelia's tears began to fall, streaking her cheeks and darkening the sand where they landed. Her castle walls collapsed as her body shook. Karen did not soften. She turned the bear in her hand as if it were evidence of something sinister, as though the worn stitches and faded fur were marks of guilt rather than love. She looked back down at the crying child and saw not fear, but resistance. And that resistance, in Karen's mind, demanded action. Her hand moved to her pocket, pulling out her phone with the swiftness of a decision long prepared. She pressed the screen and lifted it to her ear, her voice immediately shifting into the calculated tone of false concern. The number she dialed was 911. She reported a suspicious black child in the neighborhood, using each word carefully, each phrase designed to cast doubt and invite urgency. She described Amelia's magnifying glass as a strange device, her play as tampering with property, her tears as erratic behavior. She painted the scene with dark strokes, twisting the bright afternoon into something dangerous. Her words were chosen with precision, every syllable intended to reshape a little girl's innocence into menace. Amelia sat in the sand, her sobs quieting into hiccups of despair. She heard the words "police" through the veil of her fear, and though she did not understand all of what was said, she understood enough. In her young mind, police only came for those who were bad, and if they were coming for her, then she must be bad. She whispered to Teddy in her mind, though he was no longer in her arms, telling him that she did not mean to be bad, that she only wanted to play. Neighbors began to notice. Curtains shifted. Doors opened. Mrs. Lee, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun, stepped onto her porch with a watering can still in hand. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the scene, the girl's crumpled posture, the adult looming over her. Her heart ached, but she hesitated. Karen had a reputation for confrontation, and Mrs. Lee had avoided conflict for most of her life. She lingered at the edge of her property, silent but uneasy. Farther down the street, Mr. Gonzalez set aside the rake he had been using in his yard. He saw the girl's distress, the tears that caught the light, the woman clutching a toy as if it were contraband. His instincts, shaped by years as a grandfather, told him that what he saw was wrong. Yet even he paused, uncertain of what would happen if he walked closer, uncertain if his voice would matter against the authority Karen projected. The neighborhood watched with the passivity of those caught between sympathy and fear. Their silence formed a barrier as strong as any fence. Amelia, surrounded by nothing but the remains of her collapsed towers and the emptiness in her arms, felt the walls of her small world closing in. She did not know that her father was sitting in a meeting miles away, believing she was safe in the neighborhood he had chosen for her. She did not know that the wheels of misunderstanding and prejudice had already been set into motion. She only knew that she wanted Teddy back, that she wanted to run to her father, and that the adults around her were not the protectors she had always believed them to be. Karen lowered her phone, her report delivered, her voice calm and rehearsed. She looked down at the girl, satisfied in her own mind that she had acted for the good of the community. She convinced herself that she was brave, that she was standing guard while others looked away. The neighbors continued to watch, some shaking their heads, some turning back inside, all of them leaving Amelia to face the moment alone. In the sandbox, the girl wiped at her eyes with sandy fingers, smearing grit across her skin. She whispered to herself that she wanted her daddy. She wanted him now, not later, not after work, but in this moment, before the police came. She did not know how to make him appear, only that she believed in him as much as she believed in the story she told Teddy. But belief alone could not stop what had already been set in motion. The neighborhood that had seemed so perfect in the morning had shifted. The hedges, the cars, the bright facades of the houses now seemed indifferent, as if they too were waiting for the wail of sirens. The sunshine felt harsher, the silence heavier. The world Amelia had built with her small hands had been dismantled, and in its place stood fear. And across the street, Karen Wallace waited with grim satisfaction for the sound that would confirm her authority, the rising cry of police cars turning onto Willow Creek. The transition from innocence to suspicion had happened in minutes, but its consequences would stretch far beyond the boundaries of one afternoon. As Amelia sat alone in the broken sand, the stage was set for something she could not understand, but would never forget. The sound of sirens rose in the distance, faint at first, then steadily growing louder until the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Birds scattered from the trees, their wings beating frantically as the wail of approaching police cars cut through the warm afternoon. For Amelia, crouched in her sandbox, with sand clinging to her tear-streaked face, the sound was like a final judgment. She looked up, eyes wide with terror, her small arms clutching Teddy once more after Karen tossed him back toward her as if discarding a useless object. The little girl pressed the bear against her chest as tightly as she could, whispering words too soft for anyone to hear, telling him that she was scared, that she had not been bad, that she only wanted to play. The first car turned onto Willow Creek, red and blue lights bouncing against the white facades of the houses, followed by a second and then a third. Neighbors poured from their porches and driveways, their faces curious, concerned, or wary, drawn as much by spectacle as by worry. The sirens cut off abruptly as the vehicles stopped in a tight line in front of the Johnsons' house. For a moment, silence settled again, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of unease, the heavy pause before something inevitable. Amelia's tiny body shook with fear. She had seen police officers before, standing beside her father at parades or speaking at community events, but those had been smiling men and women waving to crowds, symbols of safety. Now the doors of the police cars opened with sharp metallic sounds, and 3 uniformed officers stepped out, their boots firm against the pavement, their movements deliberate. To a child's eyes, they were giants, their badges gleaming in the sun, their radios crackling faintly. They approached not with warmth, but with caution, because in their ears still lingered the dispatcher's message about a suspicious child engaged in erratic behavior. They did not yet see Amelia as Amelia. They saw a report they were meant to investigate. Karen straightened as the officers walked toward her. The satisfaction on her face deepened, as if she had orchestrated the entire event. She pointed toward the sandbox, her voice ringing with practiced urgency. She repeated the story she had told over the phone, embellishing it further. She spoke of the child's strange behavior, of her refusal to give a proper address, of her destruction of property. Every word was crafted to sound like civic duty, as though she had saved her community from a danger no one else was brave enough to confront. The officers listened, their eyes flicking from Karen to the small figure in the sandbox. Amelia did not understand their words, but she understood their presence. She buried her face in Teddy's worn fur, wishing she could disappear into the sand and never be seen. Her little shoulders shook, her knees dug into the warm grit, and her whispers grew louder, desperate affirmations that she wasn't bad, that she only wanted her father. Mrs. Lee stood on her porch, the watering can still in her hand. She wanted to shout that the girl was innocent, that she had seen her playing with nothing more than sand and toys, but her voice caught in her throat. Years of keeping to herself, of avoiding conflict, weighed her down. She bit her lip until it trembled, torn between silence and courage. Mr. Gonzalez took a step closer to the street, his weathered hands curling into fists. He thought of his own grandchildren, of their laughter when they played in his yard, of the way they too sometimes stumbled over their words when nervous. His instincts told him to intervene, but doubt whispered that perhaps the police knew better, that perhaps speaking out would make things worse. He stood in painful hesitation, watching a child crumble under the gaze of authority. The officers split their focus. One approached Karen to gather more details, nodding as she spoke with unshakable certainty. Another looked directly at Amelia, studying her trembling form. The rookie among them lingered slightly behind, her eyes softening as she took in the sight of a 5-year-old girl who looked nothing like the threat described in the report. But inexperience made her cautious, and she held her tongue, unwilling to contradict her seniors in front of a growing crowd. Amelia shifted in the sand, her small hands clutching Teddy so tightly her knuckles whitened. She lifted her tear-stained face, just enough to see the tall figures closing in, their shadows stretching long across the sandbox. She remembered her father's lessons about safety, how he told her to stay calm if ever she felt scared, to trust the right adults. But how could she trust these adults when they looked at her as though she had done something wrong? The world tilted. The sandbox that had been her kingdom now felt like a trap. Karen's voice rose louder, carrying over the murmurs of the neighbors. She insisted that the girl did not belong, that she had been wandering unsupervised, that she had refused to give the correct address when questioned. Each claim was delivered with confidence, and the weight of that confidence pressed heavily against the truth that trembled in Amelia's small frame. The child opened her mouth to correct the mistake, to say again that her house was 421, not 412, but the numbers jumbled in her frightened mind. She stammered and faltered, her words collapsing into sobs. To Karen, to those willing to listen only to her, this sounded like guilt. To Amelia, it was the sound of despair. The crowd thickened. More neighbors came out, their children pulling at their hands, asking questions they could not answer. Some whispered that it was only a little girl, that surely nothing serious was happening. Others repeated Karen's words, uncertain and impressionable, leaning toward suspicion rather than compassion. In the midst of it all, Amelia's sobs carried, a small, broken sound against the low hum of adult conversation and authority. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Amelia rocked back and forth slightly, holding Teddy like a shield, whispering for her daddy to come. She remembered his promise that morning, the kiss on her forehead, the reassurance that she was safe. But now safety felt far away, and she could not understand why strangers in uniforms were surrounding her. The rookie officer finally spoke, her voice tentative. She suggested a gentler approach, a recognition that the child was scared rather than suspicious. But her words were met with firm reminders of procedure from her more experienced partners. They pressed for answers, asked for her name, her house, her parents. Amelia tried to respond, but fear tangled her memory. She stuttered over the numbers again, confusion mixing with panic until even she doubted herself. To the officers who trusted the report, this looked evasive. To the neighbors who watched, it looked like proof that Karen was right. To Amelia, it was the collapse of her world. She hugged Teddy tighter, tears blurring her sight, and whispered again and again that she wanted her daddy. The air in Willow Creek grew heavy with judgment. The maple tree above the sandbox cast long shadows, and the once friendly sun seemed harsh and unkind. The castle Amelia had built lay in ruins, its towers flattened, its bridges broken. The world she had imagined was gone, replaced by fear she could not name. And then, as the officers prepared to take the next steps, the faint sound of a car engine approached from the end of the street. Amelia's head lifted slightly, her sobs catching in her throat. Somewhere deep inside, hope flickered. For the crowd, it was just another vehicle turning onto Willow Creek. For the girl in the sandbox, it was a chance that her whispered pleas had reached the one person she trusted most. The stage had been set. The neighborhood had gathered. The accusations had been spoken. The silence of some and the complicity of others had allowed the moment to grow. And now, into this charged scene, another figure would soon arrive, one who would see not suspicion, but his daughter's terror. The sirens had already fallen silent, but for Amelia, the nightmare was only beginning, and the promise of rescue still lay just beyond the bend in the road. The sound of an approaching car broke the thick tension that hung over Willow Creek. Neighbors turned their heads, the officers paused, and Amelia lifted her tear-streaked face from Teddy's fur with a fragile spark of hope in her eyes. The black sedan came to a sudden stop behind the line of patrol cars, and the door opened even before the engine was turned off. Out stepped Marcus Johnson, his tall frame cutting a path through the gathered crowd, his face set with a fury that made people instinctively move aside. He had driven faster than he ever had in his life, his heart pounding with dread as he saw the emergency alerts flashing on his phone. Nothing could have prepared him for the sight that now lay before him. There, in the middle of the sandbox that had once been her kingdom, sat his daughter. Her yellow dress was streaked with sand, and her cheeks were wet with tears. Her small arms wrapped tightly around Teddy, as though the bear were the only barrier between herself and a hostile world. The castle she had built was nothing but ruins scattered around her, its towers collapsed, its roads broken. Amelia looked up, and when her eyes found him, she leapt from the sand with the desperation of a child who had been lost too long. She ran to him, stumbling on her little legs, and he bent down just in time to gather her into his arms. She pressed her face into his chest, her small body shaking with sobs. Between her broken cries, he heard her words that pierced his heart deeper than any wound could. She insisted she had not been bad, that she had only been playing, that she only wanted to find pretty things like her daddy had once told her. Marcus closed his eyes, pressing his hand gently against her head, whispering promises that she was safe now, that she had done nothing wrong, though inside him burned a rage so profound it threatened to consume him. The officers froze as recognition struck. Their chief stood before them, holding the very child they had surrounded moments earlier as if she were a threat. The rookie's eyes widened in horror, her face pale, as she realized the weight of what they had done. The veteran officers stiffened, their training screaming at them to stay professional, even as shame rose in their throats. None of them could escape the truth. They had allowed themselves to be guided by a neighbor's lies rather than their own eyes. Karen Wallace stood rooted to the spot, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The satisfaction that had fueled her had drained away, leaving only disbelief and fear. She had called the police on the chief's daughter. She had woven lies about a child who had done nothing but play in her own yard. The neighbors, who had once tolerated her dominance, now looked at her with disgust, their expressions a mirror of the shame she refused to acknowledge. Marcus rose to his full height, Amelia still clinging to his neck. His gaze swept across the officers, the neighbors, and finally settled on Karen. His voice was calm when it came, but the restraint in it was sharper than anger. He asked how it had come to this, how a 5-year-old playing in a sandbox could be turned into a suspect, requiring 3 patrol cars. His eyes fixed on each officer, demanding silently what they had seen when they arrived. The silence that followed was damning. They had seen a crying child with a stuffed toy, yet they had chosen to believe the poisoned narrative of a bitter neighbor. Mrs. Lee finally found her courage. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined, and held up the watering can she still carried like a witness bearing truth. She said the little girl had been building castles, that she had found nothing but joy in the sand until Karen arrived. Her words were halting, her English imperfect, but her sincerity was undeniable. Then Mr. Gonzalez added his voice, explaining that he had watched the entire scene unfold, that he had seen the child play quietly, that the only disruption came when Karen turned her bitterness into accusation. Their testimonies spread through the crowd, shattering the illusion Karen had so carefully crafted. Karen tried to speak, to defend herself, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. She claimed she had only been trying to protect the neighborhood, that she had acted out of concern. But the faces around her told her clearly that no one believed her anymore. The neighbors who once nodded politely at her warnings now turned away, ashamed that they had ever given her authority through their silence. Marcus shifted Amelia onto one arm, her small fingers still locked into his shirt, and with his free hand, He accepted the broken pieces of plastic that Mrs. Lee handed him. It was Amelia's magnifying glass, shattered on the sidewalk in the chaos. He looked down at it, then back at his daughter, and the symbolism was inescapable. This had been given to her on her first day at school to encourage her to explore, to look closer at the world and find beauty in its details. Now it lay broken because someone had chosen suspicion over compassion. He spoke not just as a father, but as a leader. He told his officers that this moment was everything wrong with how they sometimes approached their duty. They had received a call, but instead of trusting their eyes and instincts, they had trusted fear. They had escalated where they should have de-escalated. They had treated a child as if she were a danger when she was nothing more than a daughter, a dreamer, a little girl building castles in the sand. His voice carried the weight of disappointment, not just in them, but in a system he had fought to make better. The rookie stepped forward, her voice breaking as she admitted she had felt uneasy the entire time. She confessed she had wanted to say something, but fear of contradicting her seniors had kept her silent. Marcus did not scold her. He reminded her instead that policing required courage, not just in facing danger, but in speaking when something felt wrong. Her instincts had been right, and she must never ignore them again. The veteran officers bowed their heads, their silence an acknowledgement of guilt. They would carry this shame into their reports, into their memories, a reminder that following procedure without compassion led only to harm. Karen's punishment came swiftly. Marcus announced that she would be charged with filing a false report, her words documented and exposed for the lies they were. The neighbors' eyes confirmed her social exile long before any legal action. She was no longer the guardian of their community in their minds, but the source of its deepest shame. As the crowd dispersed, whispers spread faster than the summer breeze. Parents shook their heads, horrified that it could have been their child. They realized that silence had made them complicit, that they had allowed Karen's prejudice to dictate the moment. Plans for a neighborhood meeting began forming before the sun had even set, a determination to ensure that no child would ever endure what Amelia had endured that day. In the days that followed, Marcus acted not only as a father, but as a reformer. He ordered mandatory retraining for every officer in the department, focusing on recognizing bias, protecting children, and de-escalating situations where innocence might be mistaken for threat. He instituted new protocols for evaluating calls, ensuring that suspicion rooted in prejudice would not be allowed to dictate a police response unchecked. His speeches at council meetings carried not only authority, but the lived pain of a father whose child had been scarred by the very system he led. Amelia's resilience became the heart of the story. Though she had been shaken, she was not broken. With her father's love and the quiet kindness of neighbors who now rallied around her, she returned to her sandbox. At first she hesitated, sitting with Teddy pressed tightly to her chest, glancing at the street as if expecting sirens. But slowly, day by day, she began to rebuild. Her castles rose again, taller than before. Other children from the neighborhood came to join her, bringing their own toys and adding to her sandy city. The sandbox, once the site of fear, became a place of laughter and unity. Mrs. Lee brought her a new magnifying glass, wrapped in a small gift bag, her eyes shining with gentle apology. Amelia accepted it with a shy smile, her fingers brushing the smooth lens as though it were a treasure. Mr. Gonzalez often stopped by, crouching down to admire the towers and bridges she built, telling her they were stronger than anything that had been torn down. The neighbors who had stayed silent that day now spoke loudly through their actions, teaching their own children that everyone belonged, that kindness was not optional. Marcus often stood on the porch in the evenings, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching his daughter laugh with the other children. He thought of his late wife, of the promise he had made to raise their daughter in safety, and of the irony that it had been this very neighborhood that had tried to steal that safety away. Yet as he watched Amelia's joy return, he felt a renewed determination. She had shown strength beyond her years. Her spirit had not been extinguished. Instead, it had lit a fire of change in an entire community. Karen Wallace faded into isolation. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations stopped coming. Her voice, once loud in every conversation about the neighborhood, was now ignored. She lived surrounded by the silence of those who no longer respected her. The power she had clung to had turned to ash, undone by her own prejudice. Weeks later, on a bright Saturday, Amelia spread a blanket in the yard and carefully laid out her collection of rocks and treasures. With her new magnifying glass in hand, she showed her friends the tiny crystals hidden in each stone, describing them with the wonder of a scientist and the imagination of a storyteller. Her laughter carried across Willow Creek, sweeter than any siren could ever be. The neighborhood that had once judged her now celebrated her, and the sandbox that had been a site of fear had become the foundation of something far greater. Marcus looked on, his daughter radiant in the sunlight, surrounded by friends, and safe in the place he had once doubted. He knew the journey was far from over. That prejudice could not be erased in a single summer. But he also knew that change had begun, and it had begun with a little girl who refused to let her spirit be crushed. He whispered a promise to her and to the memory of his wife. He would keep fighting, not just for Amelia, but for every child who deserved to play, to dream, and to build castles without fear. The story that had begun with sirens and tears ended with laughter and hope. It became a lesson written not only into reports and policies, but into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And as Amelia held Teddy in one hand and her magnifying glass in the other, she proved that innocence could survive even the darkest prejudice, and that from brokenness could rise a stronger, more compassionate community. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.